awesome turnout. Great to see you all here. I'm Kelly Scobier. I'm the director of the Patrick Heath Public Library, and I'm especially excited about this presentation because if I was not a librarian, I would be an archaeologist. So I'm a closet archaeologist like many of you probably in this room. Dr. Steve Tomka is coming today. He's going to tell us some really interesting things about a particular site in the county. But I want to tell you a little bit about him before we actually start speaking. He received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in 1954. Over the past 19 years, his research interests have been split between archaeology in South American and hunter-gatherer adaptations in Texas. More recently, he has become an enthusiastic student of historical archaeology, including the Mission period in Texas. Dr. Tomka was named interim director of the Center for Archaeological Research in 2001 and was named director in June 2002. Since its founding in 1974, the center and its staff have conducted the bulk of the archaeological investigations in and around San Antonio. So today he's going to talk to us about the prehistory of Texas, and he's also going to focus on a site of recent discoveries at the recently completed wastewater treatment plant on Old San Antonio Road. We're near that. So without further ado, Dr. Steve Tomka.
Thank you all for making the time to come. I know it's not easy sometime after 5 o'clock to show up to a presentation. I hope that I will make it worth it to you all. I wanted to make sure as well that you can hear me, even in the back row. As you will see, I can't be chained to a microphone. There's too much nervous energy there, so I walk around. So unless I have to, I won't pick up the microphone. But please tell me if you can hear me in the back. Good. Is it working okay? All right, it's working. Good. So what I'd like to do is first to apologize for one thing. The last presentation I did on sort of the project that I'll be talking about, I bought show and tell artifacts. I apologize for the fact that I didn't, but hopefully I've loaded enough slides, pictures of the artifacts into my talk that you'll get a sense of what we've discovered. The other thing I want to do is to tell you that once I get started, I will be going all over the place. I'm going to try to connect the prehistory of North America, and particularly then come from North America, shrink it down to Texas, and then shrink it down to a spot not far from here where we did archaeology several months ago. And so the picture will start out very, very big, and it'll start shrinking, and then the story ends at a certain point at which the archaeological record at the site that we were working at ends. But I'll fill in the last pieces of the history of Texas just so you can get a better context of how it all fits together. The other thing I want to tell you is that because I jump around a lot, I try to explain a lot of things as I come across them. But if you get lost because I've skipped 2 big steps, please raise your hand and just say, "Hey, dummy, I don't understand. Fill in this thing because you're way out in left field." Just feel free. I'm Steve. Call me Steve. There's no need for formalities. So just interact with me, and that's more fun for everybody. Okay? So to get started, what I want to talk about, and the work that we did at the Center for Archaeological Research, was at the so-called Cibolo Preserve Mangrove Creek site on the Cibolo Preserve land, and it was funded by and supported by in all sorts of ways. Funding, logistics, I mean, you name it. By the city of Boerne. So it was a great pleasure to work with them. I got to know people that were very, very instrumental in helping with the project, and just very great collaboration. And in the process, the staff we have, professional archaeologists, and myself at the university learned a great deal about the prehistory of this region, and it filled in really some of the gaps that we knew we had in the history of the region. So I will talk about those gaps. I will talk about the research. To begin with, make sure okay. What happens in Texas archaeology and prehistory really starts out at the North American continent level. When originally North America was inhabited, sometime around 12,500 years ago, or so we think. Because there are some crazy materials coming out of South America that are much earlier than that make us question whether really that 12,500-year-old date is really valid, or whether there are things here that maybe date to 30,000 years ago. But having said that, let's accept that maybe the prehistory of North America, the new continent, starts about 12,500 years ago. That time period is called the Paleoindian time period. People migrate from Siberia, or so we think, across the Bering Sea, land in North America, walk down the glaciers, and come to this very wide open country. Climate is very, very different at the time. It's colder, but wetter. And so what that gives rise to is a vegetation community that's totally, totally different than it is today. Here, in terms of sort of contrast, the vegetation community, the climate, is compared to what it was in the so-called Pleistocene, back 12,500 years ago, is really sort of dry. Back those days, it was maybe 2 or 3 degrees cooler, which is not much, but it makes a big, big difference. And it was a lot wetter. That's why you had the growth of these massive glaciers coming out of the northern part of the continent, spreading all over North America. These Indians come down, who knows what they call themselves, but these people come down the glaciers, find themselves in this wide open country. That period, I'm not sure how this works, whether it works or not. Okay, anyway, that time period that we're talking about is right down here. It's the beginning of occupation of the New World, basically. The people are called Paleo-Indian, that is early Indian, is what the term refers to. And these groups were really hunters and gatherers. What we mean by that is that most of them hunted for a living and gathered food for a living. They went out, hunted the fauna that was around, and they gathered the plants, seeds, nuts, whatever they could find, and basically lived off of that. All right. One of the things that, as I mentioned, that you have to track when you're tracking, especially human behavior, when you're tracking what people did, how did they do it, why did they do it. In the past, you have to look at what the climate was doing. Contrary to what we do today, most of the things we do today are not climate dependent. Well, except if you're a farmer, of course, or somebody like that, so I qualify that. But in normal terms, hunters and gatherers who lived entirely off the land really were dependent upon what the climate gave them, because climate controlled vegetation, climate controlled fauna, vegetation controlled fauna, and therefore if you wanted to hunt, you had to know what fauna was out there, what the prey was, what were the plants out there that were edible to eat. And so the first thing that we do as archaeologists, we try to understand how the climate worked. What were the resources that the climate offered to the people, and then we start that way understanding how the people moved across the landscape, what they hunted, what the technology was that they needed in order to hunt and to be successful. And so what you see in this graph is this is basically the human prehistory of Texas, starting at about 12,000 years ago and moving really into about 600-700 years ago. And this is the climatic history of Texas. What you see here is periods of drought at this end, the right end of the spectrum, and periods of wetness at the left end of the spectrum. So you'll see these bumpy areas of black, those denote periods of drought in Texas. And really, these droughts were so large and massive in scale that we're not talking just Texas, we're talking about much of North America was in a drought situation. And so at 12,000 years ago, when the New World is basically inhabited the first time, you have a period where it's wet and cool, and so vegetation is just flourishing, everything is going crazy. But soon after, near the end of what we call the Paleoindian period, or the Pleistocene, sometime around 11,000, 11,500, maybe 10,000 years ago, climate changes in a big, big way. This change right here is very dramatic. We don't know why. But suddenly the climate changes to drier conditions and warmer conditions. You increase the warmth, you decrease the humidity, everything starts turning into a desert-like environment. And at that point, somewhere around 9,000 years ago, these conditions, these dry conditions, persist with one exception for roughly about 5,000 years. 4,000 years for sure, maybe as much as 5,000 years ago. And so that makes a huge impact on the human population of the North America, both in terms of what resources they had at their disposition and how they went about hunting and procuring those resources. And so the archaeological work that we were doing at the sea below preserve site, really fits really squarely into this time period right here, from roughly about 7,000 years to about 3,000 years ago. So it really covers that period right there, and it really tells us specifically how human beings in this part of the world, in this part of the country, reacted to that massive drought. You know, we think that we're in a drought situation in Texas, and certainly we are. But imagine a drought that is 10 times worse than it is now, and lasting not just a decade or 2 decades, but lasting 3,000 to 4,000 years. You can imagine what kind of impact it has on people. And it's just really dramatic. It creates major shifts in population, really changes the manner in which people hunt, what they hunt, and that's what we're going to be talking about now. So, taking a step back with that as a context, the Pleistocene, which is the end of the period when New World people come into the New World and start hunting. When they arrive, the vegetation really is characterized by massive forests and large expanses of grasslands. Those grasslands support megafauna, large fauna, fauna that you don't see today. Think of elephants. That's roughly sort of the smaller end of the scale of the fauna that was roaming the land back about 12,500 years ago and just before. Mastodon and mammoth really are the two typical critters that these people would have hunted. Here's a mastodon and a human being. As a scale, you can see it's quite a bit, quite dramatically different. A mammoth, equally large. And then we have our bison, which is something that we're all more familiar with. The antique bison that was living at the time mastodon and mammoth lived is gigantic compared to the one that lives today. And so those three fauna, those three major resources were the mainstay of hunters at the time, 12,500 years ago. What happens though is, and when the Paleo-Indian people come in, really they come in with a toolkit that's already to a large extent fixed. And a lot of people, when we talk about Paleo-Indian, they will ask, well, are they Neanderthals? You know, what do they look like? Are they look like us or not? And it's really, we're not talking about Neanderthals, because Neanderthals lived probably about 20,000 years prior to these guys. We're talking about people 12,000 years ago. They were pretty much like modern people. You would put a tie and coat on, they would look just like us, just like me probably, with a little bit longer hair. And so you could lose them in our current society. But they were upright, they were very, very bright, they were adventurous, they knew, they really were interested in discovering new countries, followed game. We're not certain what brought them into the New World, except we know that they walked across that land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, but why, we don't know. Whether they were running out of food, on the other continent, and they were following prey, following species that were migrating into the New World, we do not know. But they really were extremely good hunters. They showed up in the New World and had a toolkit that was just perfectly well suited for hunting. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. We know that they hunted megafauna, these huge critters, because the earliest projector points that we find in archaeological sites in the New World, in Clovis, New Mexico, are projector points that we call spear points that now we call Clovis points because we named them after the town where they were first discovered, and we'll show some pictures of them. But that we also know from some of the sites that have been discovered since the 50s, when the first Clovis point was discovered, that they were really much broader in terms of subsistence. They didn't just hunt big fauna, because if they would have specialized in that, they probably would have starved and died out much earlier than they did. We have some sites actually not far from Austin, near Leander, where Clovis people and Folsom people, the people that came right after the Clovis, camped there for several seasons, for roughly about 200 years, but several seasons during that time period. And they ate fish, they ate turtles, they hunted antelope and deer. I mean, they hunted everything that was available. When you can't depend on HEB to go every night and pick up your supper, you basically depend on what you can in order to make a living. And these people depended on everything. Of course, when a large package of food arrived, like a mastodon or a mammoth, they attacked it. Because the way it works is the larger the meat package, the more you gain out of it. You put roughly a little bit more effort into it, but the amount of gain that you get out of it is so much better that it's always, archaeologists call it optimally foraging, meaning that if you have had a full sheet of cake of cake, you'd rather go after it than a 1/8 of a sheet of cake, right? Because for the same amount of effort, you get much more cake. These guys thought the same way, right? The less effort they had to put in, the bigger the package of food, they went after it. And so that's why they were really specializing in these massive packages of meat, these mastodon and mammoth. The other thing we know about them is they were super craftsmen. They were really good at making tools. And tool making is really, in a way, was invented roughly about 350,000 years ago in Africa. If you've heard of Lucy and you've heard of Olduvai Gorge, in Africa, that's what we're talking about. Those people back then, 350,000, 400,000 years ago, really, were the ones that first made tools. Picked up a rock, knocked off a couple of flakes, and then used those flakes, the chips, to use as knives. And that was the most primitive tool making. But it was many, many thousands of years before the Clovis folks came around. When these guys came around, they were super craftsmen. It was like, light years ahead of them. They were still only making stone tools, but they were just so much more technologically advanced. We'll mention a little bit more of that in a minute. The other thing that makes Texas special, not only that the megafauna was migrating from the north to the south, because the glaciers were constantly moving back and forth and pushing the megafauna south, is that Texas is extremely lucky in terms of raw material that we have. The Edwards Plateau is all limestone. Limestone contains these nodules of chert, flint, as the English like to call it. And they call it so because flintlock flames are made out of that chert, basically that flint. But that chert is extremely good quality. It's consistent, it's hard enough yet soft enough to flake easily, and when you knock off a chip, it keeps that edge extremely sharp for a long time. All of those characteristics, plus the fact that it's extremely abundant on the Edwards Plateau, starting with the edge of the Edwards Escarpment, everywhere where you see limestone up on the hill country, you see chert, and that chert is extremely valuable. If you look at the continent level, there's only maybe 2 or 3 other states in the entire continent where you have chert sources that rival those in Texas, rival those on the Edwards Plateau. And so these Paleogen people, when they followed these migrations of large animals, they literally followed them for hundreds and hundreds of miles. We know that how? We know that because chert from the Georgetown area is one of those places where the outcrops of this chert are very close to the ground and are massive in amount. People would come down to that location, Paleogen people, would come down to those locations, make tools out of those cherts, and then take off for Colorado, take off for Nebraska, take off for Iowa. I mean, it's just incredible the distances these raw materials would travel, because people travel. But they picked them up, they came down, especially here, following the herds, but they came down because that chert was available and it was such a good quality. So we know that people traveled massive distances, and we know that archaeologically because we can recognize this raw material occurring in places where it really was not occurring naturally. So somebody had to come and pick it up and then travel with it that distance. Okay. So we mentioned briefly Clovis. By the way, I'm supposed to finish at roughly about 7:15 or so. I'm going to pick up the pace here, but you're seeing already probably the fact that it'll last till 7:30 easily. And so just hang with me, please. Okay. We've only covered maybe, well, not even the first 150 years, but it's already 20 minutes in. Okay, so Clovis people were these magnificent hunters, first to arrive into the New World, roughly about 12,500 years ago. Soon after, within about 500 to 700 years, the megafauna started decreasing in size, in quantity. Mastodon mammoth, for some reason, the main reason is that the climate change begins to happen, everything starts drying out, the resources for those large animals are no longer there, and they're starting to die out as well. There's another competing hypothesis that maybe some of the changing climate and the decrease in resources has to do with asteroids. hitting the earth. There's possibly some truth to that. There are parts of the world where you have consistent evidence right around 12,000 years, well, about 10,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago, that there was some massive event that really changed climate. Yes?
Steve, wasn't the megafauna disappearing in Europe also at the same time?
Yes.
They didn't have Clovis points?
That is correct. There was disappearing everywhere, except on a couple of little islands here and there where they shrank. But it's a continent and worldwide really event. So whatever you're arguing in terms of what the reasoning was, it has to cover, it has to sort of explain a continent-wide and a worldwide event, not just a continent-wide event. So that's a very good point, because every time you explain something in archaeology, you have to think big and little and try to find an explanation that fits both. And so the megafauna is dying out, and the new group of people come to light, basically. These people are, for lack of a better term, we call them Folsom people. The reason is that they make a different style of projectile point, and because we're really ignorant about what they call themselves, and we're never going to find out, the best way to call them is basically by the name of the point that we gave to that particular shape. Archaeologists name all these things. And because we lack inspiration, we name them after the towns where we find them. And so that's, every time I mention a point, there's an equivalent town somewhere in the States, that this is named after. The interesting thing about the Folsom points is that they're a little bit smaller than the Clovis. Clovis usually is about a 4-inch thick, maybe 2 inches wide blade that's really powerful, sits on the end of a spear or a dart, and it's propelled by an arrow or throwing stick. And here's my only piece of thing that I brought with me. This is a throwing stick. It's basically a stick with a hook at the end. Typically the end of the spear, and I'll correct myself in just a second, the end of the projectile fits in this hook, and then you throw it like that. And all this does, it lengthens your arm. It gives you twice the length of the arm that you have otherwise, and because it does so, it allows contact with that projectile for a fraction of a second longer than if you just throw it by hand. That fraction of a second gives you enough power that it launches this probably 3 times as far as you would if you're trying to throw it just with a naked hand, naked arm. And so it really makes a big difference, both in terms of the distance that you can achieve, as well as the power with which that spear will hit the target. What's neat is that it's really not a spear, after having talked to you into that. What it is like a spear, but it's considerably lighter. A spear, typically, when we talk about spears, think about spears in Africa. Those things that are handheld and basically are thrust at something and an enemy or another animal. What you throw with the throwing stick is actually what we call a dart. A dart is a lighter spear, smaller in diameter, maybe ½ an inch maximum, and roughly about 6 feet long. They are lighter, so they fly faster and farther, but when they get there, they're still pretty powerful because they're pretty heavy still. And when they hit the animal, even a large animal, they penetrate really well, particularly when you have a big stone tip that's very sharp on the end. And so this technology comes into the New World with these new hunters 12,500 years ago, and it really persists roughly until about 1,800 years ago, at which point the bow and arrow come in. But for really 10,000 years of the prehistory of North America, it's this weapon that's the revolutionary weapon in the New World. And it just achieves amazing things. Okay? So that's both the Clovis hunters and the Folsom hunters pack basically these things with darts. There is a little bit of a discussion, and that's why I have the spear/dart point up on the Clovis part, as to whether really some of the Clovis points were spears. It's very difficult to have evidence because wood doesn't preserve 12,000 years under typical circumstances. But there are people that argue that the nature of the wounds on some of these mammoth bones that we're seeing archaeologically, and bone sometimes does preserve, crazily enough, that long, suggests that the weapon was thrust into the animal from close nearby rather than thrown at the animal. If that's the case, that would define the weapon as a spear rather than a dart being thrown by a throwing stick. But again, that's out there, and so I wanted to bring it up just to to make you realize that we don't know everything. I certainly don't know everything, and so there are always questions. Whatever I say something, don't necessarily believe it. If you think about it, question it, because there are simple reasons to question a lot of things. Here's an example of the Clovis coin. These things again are massive. They're thick. The one neat thing about them, and one thing that really makes them stand out, is this channel flake. It occurs on both faces. If you flip it over, there would be another one just on the other face. And they're hafted into split sticks. This part of the stick is called a foreshaft. There's a narrowing of the tip here, and it's stuck into a main shaft. Basically, the main shaft is hollow near the tip, and then at the back end, just like an arrow does, it has 2 or 3 feathers or fletchings. What that does, those fletchings basically control the flight, so that once it leaves the throwing stick, it stabilizes and flies straight. Once it flies straight, then it will hit the target that you want to hit. But without the feathers, it won't fly straight for long distances. And the beauty of this technology here, of separating the point, putting it onto a foreshaft, and then using the foreshaft into the shaft, is that once you take out the foreshaft, you have basically a pocket knife. You have a knife with a handle on it. And so these things typically are not just projectile points, they're not just intended to kill the animal by piercing the animal, but also once that's done, you pull it out of the animal, you take the 2 pieces apart, and you use it to butcher the animal with. And so it's a multifunctional tool, knife and projectile. And it's not an easy invention. These guys are smart. It's like an early version of the Swiss Army knife, basically, except these guys probably were not Swiss. And so, extremely good technology. And what's amazing is, that projectile point, again, it's light years ahead of what came out of Olduvai Gorge 300,000 years before. But when it came to this country, it came finished. Typically, when we see new technologies come about, they start out pretty rough. Think of the Model T as opposed to a Ferrari. Quite a difference between them. The same thing with projectile points and technology. The very first projectile points that should come into the new world should be pretty rough, basic, sort of ugly things. These are not. These are extremely sophisticated weapons. So that makes you wonder, where the heck did they come from? We don't know. But when they came ready. They came perfectly well made and just really extremely well suited for what the purpose that they were used. Here's a picture of how the atlatl and dart works. Again, the atlatl is this. The dart is what's sticking out of it. Here too you can see the foreshaft with the point on the end of it. Main shaft here and the feathers at the end. It's extremely, extremely effective. There are atlatl associations out there today. Some for primitive weapons and some for souped-up modernized weapons where they use aluminum shafts. The record for distance with aluminum shaft is roughly about 3 football fields long. The record for primitive ones is a little bit more than 2 football fields long. So you can imagine, 200 plus feet flying weapon like that and hitting a critter 200 feet away, or 200 yards away, I'm sorry, not feet away. So it's a pretty amazing weapon. Yeah, and those that can handle it, it's deadly. The other thing that tells us that these Clovis folks were extremely good flint knappers are these cores. These are pieces of chert that usually start out big blocky, not as large as the stable, but you take the platform and roughly some of the rocks can be that big. They split large pieces off of them, and they knock these kinds of blades off the sides. And these blades, you can see, it's basically having like a knife blade that's about that long and about maybe 1.5 inches wide, with very sharp edges on it. They were extremely efficient at making those. At the preserve, by the way, there was at least 1 or 2 of these cores found, indicating that Clovis people had come through here, had gathered some of that raw material, and were fabricating these blades. We don't know quite what they were making with the blades, but use-wear, when we look at it under the microscope, use-wear tells us that they're using it to cut with, they're using it to scrape with, and potentially when they break in the ends, they use the middle part to make projectile points out of it as well. So it was basically their way of creating a plank that then they could create walk around with, carry around, and make several different kinds of things out of it. I could count probably, archaeologists, the other thing about archaeologists, they're fond about learning what prehistoric people did. And so many archaeologists will learn and try to replicate what prehistoric people do. I literally could count probably maybe 15 archaeologists today that can replicate that technology to where you couldn't tell it apart from the Clovis people. And so that tells you that it's a pretty difficult thing to do to be able to make that time and time again. But these guys were churning them out really in droves. Folsom points, the next point that comes up after Clovis, it shrinks in size. But what's interesting about it is that it shrinks in size about the time that the climate changes. And with climate change, you go from these megafauna to smaller critters. And one of the hypotheses is that it shrinks in size because the game shrinks in size. You don't have mastodon and mammoth anymore. You have bison, antelope, and deer, and you don't need your weapon that's that big, because all you really need for the weapon to be effective is to create a cut in the hide and through the muscle. Once that's accomplished, then the rest of it is all penetration, and it kills the animal. So one hypothesis is that Folsom points, which are really prevalent in Texas, again, shrank because of the prey changed. Okay, so Pleistocene comes about, everything changes in terms of climate. By between 11 and 10,000 years ago, climatic conditions were really quite drastically different from the previous Pleistocene. Megafauna become really extinct for the most part, but you have a number of smaller critters that come in. People are faced with really having to change. One of the changes potentially is that the Folsom point. The other thing that happens is not only the fauna changes, but vegetation changes. And so instead of eating the plant resources that you had before, those are gone, and really the land is now dominated by grasslands. Forests tend to recede. The more water you have, the more likely that forests grow out of their river basins and spread into the highlands, uplands, and off onto the terraces. You reduce the water, trees die out, everything is taken over by grass. That's a process that exists today. It existed there 10,000 years ago. And so plant communities become dominated by grasslands. Interestingly enough, the scale of migration that we see during Paleo-Indian times also seems to shrink. We start seeing groups of projectile points, differently named than those other ones, just localized in a part of a state or just in a few counties. That tells us, if we're right that people or points equal people, it tells us that what's happening is that people become less mobile. Instead of traveling 300, 400, 500 miles in a year, they travel maybe a couple of hundred miles within an area that's pretty circumscribed, which is kind of interesting, and we can come back to that unless you ask about it. Point styles become more numerous as well. Instead of having just 2 point styles, really, and these 2 point styles, Folsom and Clovis, really cover the entire North American continent, which is crazy in itself when you think about it, because either you had to have a lot of Folsom and Clovis points, or there were a few of them, but they were running all over the place. And it's more likely that it's that, but it's still kind of interesting to ask how people 12,000 years ago, could spread that far and wide without really, large densities of people. We don't quite understand it. It's a really interesting phenomenon. But what happens, once the Pleistocene ends, all of these other point styles take over. From about 10,000 years ago to about 7,000 years ago, all of these new forms come about. They're very different. Well, all of these are not very different from Clovis and Folsom in that they're leaf-shaped. They're parallel-sided. Some of them are narrow and pointed, which is characteristics of both Folsom and Clovis. But then at the end of that time period, in the time period about 8,000 to about 7,000 years ago, you start getting a totally different shape, which we call stem. They have ears, they have barbs on them, totally different tradition than what the Paleo-Indian points are. And so there's some sea changes happening in about a 2,000 to 3,000 year period at the end of the Pleistocene that totally sort of talk about it, and reference really a new sort of changing technology that hadn't been seen before. What it does go with, we think, is the new animals that are being hunted. You have the modern bison, you have deer and antelope there. That's what's left there for the hunters and gatherers. The big packages of meat are gone, and the biggest one now is the modern bison, which is still big, but it's very different from that antique bison and the megafauna, the mastodon and mammoth. So we're really talking about a totally different set of animals that are being hunted. Therefore, the technology, the ways in which you hunt. Hunters, basically, those of you that hunt, especially deer, bow hunters, know that you have to learn the behavior of the animal to be successful in hunting. These guys did the same thing. And because the behavior of the animals themselves were different, they now have to learn a totally different set of behaviors to track and have a totally different weapons technology that makes it work against these critters as opposed to the megafauna. So major changes were occurring in the cultures. We talked about forest shrinking. Most of these forests now are going back into the river valleys, and the uplands are now covered with large grasslands and every now and then oak mounds. And we're talking now about the hill country. We know this how? We know this because we've done pollen studies, phyla studies. These are microscopic evidences of the vegetation that grew here thousands of years ago. When those pollen spores, the ones that cause you to sneeze every spring and fall, when those pollen spores are preserved, and we look at them archaeologically, we can tell the species of wood, species of grasses that grew around here. From those, we know that the climate changed, and at this period, from about 7,000 years ago to roughly really about 3,500 years ago, the vegetation became dominated by grasslands. Forests drew back into the valleys, and much of the uplands, really the hill country, was probably more grasslands with oak mounds, here and there. And so pollen is very, very significant. Okay, so the major drought comes about 9,000 years ago. It really lasts in waves, but the first wave lasts roughly until 6,000 years ago. As a result of all of that diet shift, and there's two loves up there, plants and seeds become more important because the animals' packages have grown smaller. New processing technologies suddenly have to come about too. Now you're dealing with having to process and eat foods that you